Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's returning conversant is Professor Patrick Miller. He was actually one of my first interviews back in 2017, and we spoke again in 2021, if I recall correctly. And in this conversation, we catch up. He used to be a professor at Duquesne University, but has since moved on to being the key lead of a center at Western Virginia University that is seeking to establish a based department within the hallowed halls of higher education and return some non-communist points of view to the institutions. Sounds like an actually fascinating project. We spent a lot of time offline talking about the details of this. Actually, he's doing key work in trying to right the trajectory of academia in America. But in this conversation, we talk about Plato, talk about liberalism, talk about Nietzsche a lot. We get into the philosophical weeds, and I just always enjoy having him on. Got to have him on a little bit more than once every 4 or 5 years. You can find links to his institute down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Every little bit helps. Really appreciate you guys tuning in. Without further ado, here is Patrick Miller. How's academia doing?
Academia's in trouble. I think.
When did that happen?
Pardon me?
When did that happen?
Well, enrollments, people have known that enrollments are going to be going down for quite a while. I think, I forget what it's called, the apocalypse or the demographic cliff or something like that.
Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, demographics. It's not like a college bubble because it was overinflated price-wise.
Well, no, that's also true, but that, people didn't have babies after the financial crisis in 2008. And I forget the math exactly, but right around now is when that baby dip is hitting colleges. So enrollments are down for that reason alone, but then there are lots of other reasons as well. So the way in which the humanities and social sciences especially have been politicized, let's say in the last 10 years, but going farther back than that, because they've been politicized in a leftward direction, Republicans, registered Republicans, let's just say conservatives, but they do the measurements using registrations, have lost confidence in higher education. So if half the country is, roughly conservative, whatever it is, 35, 40%, if you've got that chunk of people losing confidence in what you're doing, plus a demographic cliff, I'm sure there are other reasons, but I would think
plus the value.
What do I think the value is?
Plus the value, but yeah, what is the value of a higher education at this point in time?
Well, what it should be ideally is, liberal education should be what it says it is, which is acquiring a free mind. The idea of the liberal arts was the skills or the arts that free you, and I think that's been completely lost in the idea that higher ed is a finishing school for the job market, or that it's vocational training, so that majors get measured according to, what the mean income of the graduates is, or, how many get employment in that field within so many years and so on. Of course, employment's important, but the central value of the liberal education in the first place was what it did to your soul in itself. And ideally, the world would recognize that in certain ways. But when you lose the focus of what made it distinct, then it's only a matter of time before the consequences of that start deteriorating as well. And AI has just really just been a full frontal assault on.
Really?
Yeah. So there's the practical problem of how do you assess student work? Written work is just practically impossible to assess because you just don't know. You just don't know where it's coming from. And people are trying to come up with solutions to that. People have various things like in-class exams, the old blue book, more presentations and so on. But one of the most important tasks of a humanities education has been to learn how to write well. And now we're to the point where you don't even know that the students are doing their own writing, and many admit that they aren't. So there are a lot of problems. And I guess I'd say also with the AI problem is that I actually like the arrival of AI in this regard, because I think one thing that we were doing beforehand was sort of training little human AIs we were getting them to,
Yeah.
reproduce the ideas back in the papers, punishing them for outlying ideas and so on, and giving them their A-, so long as they didn't say anything too spicy. And the AIs do that better than the humans, it turns out. And so now we can get the humans back to what they were supposed to be doing in the first place, which was acquiring free minds.
Freedom from what?
I'll
Human
use a
bondage?
word that might have the wrong connotations in this context, but I hope I'll explain. I would say freedom from the regime. And so by the regime, I mean more than the government or even the political order. I mean the entire cultural order. So you're no doubt familiar with Plato's Cave. Some of your listeners won't be, but it's the most important philosophical idea or metaphor, whatever you like, for me. So if I could just
Okay.
explain it quickly, because I think I'll be able to explain a lot of other things by reference to it. So Plato has this story in the Republic, Book 7, of prisoners at the bottom of a cave. And crucially, they've been there their entire lives. So, it's hard to imagine how this would happen, but the movie The Matrix kind of gives you an idea of how technologically something like this might be possible. Humans are raised in an environment that's entirely artificial, and they take it to be real because it's all they've ever known. And in the cave, what they see are these images projected on the wall in front of them that are projected by puppeteers who have various models that they parade in front of a fire, and then they make noises. And again, since the prisoners have only ever seen these shadows on the wall, they think that those things are real. And it's not like they see them and they think, okay, these are real. It's that they live as if they're real because they know nothing else. And what the philosopher is supposed to do, according to Plato, is come in from the outside of the cave where there is reality and draw someone, the student, out of the cave. It's a long story how that happens and how did the philosopher get out of the cave in the first place and so on. But just to answer your immediate question of freeing the mind from what, I would say freeing the mind from the cave. And so when I say the regime, I mean the cave, where an entire notion of what's real. The reason I think regime is a helpful term, despite the misunderstandings it might cause, is that those images on that wall are being projected by a set of people, the puppeteers, I call them.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an important political resonance to the cave that's often ignored, that those people are being kept in that illusion by, let's call them an elite class, the people who are aware that it's an illusion but are somehow profiting from it. And so I would say when it comes to education, and here I'm just parroting Plato, a real education is getting you out of the cave. A fake education is one that trains you to play the game of the shadows more successfully. So he says some people are going to be good at identifying which shadows follow which shadows. You see shadow A and then shadow B follows afterwards, and you make a bet that shadow B will follow shadow A, and you win the bet. We'll call that the stock market. So you get money, which would itself just be an image in that shadow play. And so an education that trains you to make money or get status or get power would be training you to play the cave game better, not have contact with reality, whereas a real education would draw you out of the cave. And I think that's one reason why higher ed is suffering, at least when it comes to the humanities and social sciences, that it's lost that idea of what it's supposed to be doing, which is pulling you out of the cave. Rather, it's quite explicitly saying we're going to make you better at getting a job and getting a high paying job by playing the cave game.
This sounds a little idealistic.
Yeah.
Is that where
Wrong with that?
your Platonism is showing?
Yeah, yeah. So tell me what's wrong with being an idealist when it comes to education?
Well, I mean, right away, practical reality intrudes on the metaphor of the cave, because you can't do anything if you don't have money. You can't have a family, can't start a family. Isn't that part of reality? How do you engage with modern reality without learning skills, vocations, engaging with that?
Yeah.
And then also the question of who who really deserves or requires or is amenable to that type of education? Would you say most people, some people, all people, few?
I would say few.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before we get into that thorny question, I would, I guess, just repeat what I said earlier that, yeah, jobs are really important. People have to make a living. The economy has to keep going and so on. The philosopher, the liberal mind can't exist in a vacuum.
It
Um,
really likes to, though. It really loves that view from nowhere. It really does.
yes, it
I mean,
does.
I'm a liberal despite myself. At this point in time, I think I'm a liberal with post-liberal inclinations.
Okay. So what do you mean by that when you say you're a liberal?
I'm a liberal because I believe that people should be free to choose according to their conscience, and that the rational mind is a high and mighty vocation, and the work required to uphold it is not within freedom itself. Liberty, this is where I branch out of it. Liberty is absolutely essential to my way of understanding human society, and yet that liberty doesn't come from itself. It comes from something else. It can't perpetuate itself. I don't think liberalism, broadly construed, is able to perpetuate actual liberalism, because it
Okay.
strips itself from the foundations that allowed for people to be free. And
Okay.
freedom is necessarily based on virtue, and virtue precedes obligation to a higher moral framework preexists liberty. It
Hmm.
has to, because otherwise you only have chaos. You only have hedonism. You have nothing to guide you outside of freedom from.
Hmm.
So freedom itself, I just, at this point, and you were one of my first interviewees, sorry.
Yeah,
One of my
I
first
know. Yeah,
interviews. That was
I,
2017.
I
And
remember that. Yeah.
our first one was Lost. You went into detail about Nietzsche's eternal return. And you opened my mind with that, and then I lost it. I'm like, damn it, that was such a good. Like, I want to understood what remember what you helped me understand. But in that time, in that 9 years, I've gone through. You know, the world is awokened, or wokeified itself, and then the aftermath of that woke revolution or wokepocalypse or whatever you want to call it caused me to question where that wokeness came from, and it seems like it came from liberalism, even though it was a mutated strain of liberalism. It's still derived from liberalism, and it's liberalism without responsibility. It's
Mm.
emancipation without virtue, and it just doesn't make sense. So, I
Yeah.
mean, and these are questions that I don't think Plato necessarily, no, Plato absolutely gets into. He talks about virtue probably and the good much more than he talks about freedom itself.
That's right.
He
Yeah.
probably talks about good before he even talks about the cave, right? You have to have this orientation towards the real that's beyond that particular metaphor of emancipation. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So he does talk about the good before he talks about the cave, right before, in fact.
Hmm.
And again, for those who aren't familiar with the metaphor, by the way, I'm just sort of curious, what's the demographics of your audience? I'm going to return to that point, but I'm wondering, uh, it's probably broad, and maybe I'll just
Yeah.
put my cards on the table. I'm
I'm
wondering,
pretty sure at this point in time, people are aware of the basics of Plato
yeah,
and
yeah,
basic philosophy. We've covered a lot of that on my channel. And it's part of the discourse. If you want to scratch the surface of discourse, you have to get through Aristotle, Plato, before you can get to anybody else. I mean, other
yeah,
than Christianity, but even Christianity borrows or interlocks so much with the Platonic and the Aristotelian dialogues that you have to do both.
yeah. Okay. Well, the reason I ask is that I'm wondering if sort of 16 and 17-year-olds listen, because I would imagine they're not familiar yet with Plato, or at least the details of the Republic and so on. And the reason I want to speak to everybody that's in your audience, but I'm especially interested in reaching them because I want them
Mm.
to come to WVU and study with me. So
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
if I say things that your audience already knows, forgive me. It's only because that I'm trying to
Send
speak to
this to
them.
your high school graduate, please.
Yeah, yeah. So he does talk about the good before he talks about the cave. And then he goes on afterwards to talk about the ideal regime that's led by the philosopher King famously. And what makes the philosopher king distinct as a ruler, and philosopher queens, by the way, not often emphasize that he thinks that women can play this role as well, is that they orient themselves primarily to the good. And then when they turn back to rule the city with justice, they do so in light of understanding what reality is. And then he talks about degenerate versions of that ideal regime. I mean, I didn't say much specific about it, but for our purposes, the degenerate versions substitute fake goods for that real good. And to simplify, Plato thinks that's God, effectively. So in the ideal regime, the leaders are oriented towards God and then rule in light of their understanding of God. And then in the degenerate regimes, rather than orienting themselves and then their state towards God, they orient it towards honor is the first degenerate version, wealth is the second, freedom is the third, and then power for its own sake is the fourth. And so those regimes have different names. Oligarchy is a name people will recognize as the orientation towards wealth. Democracy is the orientation towards freedom, and tyranny is the orientation towards power. The one for honor is a Greek word that nobody uses anymore.
What's the word?
Timocracy, which just means rule of those who care about honor.
So that's more of a, sounds almost fascistic, and I don't think
Yeah,
fascism is necessarily a bad word. If you can get over like the way it's used as a slur, it's not really a slur, but it's based on honor
yeah,
and duty.
military.
Yeah,
Yeah,
military.
the
Yeah.
military culture. Imagine Sparta is what he has in mind. A state ruled by the military leaders, and for the sake of military values, victory, which is how you get honor in victory by behaving bravely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to tie it back to how we got into that, Plato thinks freedom is good, better to be free than not free most of the time, but it's not the good. And the argument, straightforward, that it's not the good is that you can use your freedom badly. If it's just a matter of choice between X and Y, well, that allows you to choose Y. And if Y is bad, then the thing that promoted the bad is not therefore the good.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks
What's
true. Oh, go ahead.
continue?
Oh, I was just say he thinks true freedom is living in your desire for the good. So you want nothing else because the good or God satisfies your soul completely. And that's true freedom. You don't even need to choose anything because nothing can compare. This idea that freedom is I can have X or I can have Y, and I make up my mind between the two of them. For Plato, that's itself a degenerate version of freedom. But it's what most of us think of when we think of freedom. So that's why, he
Mm-hmm.
goes on to say that democracy has freedom as its good.
Mm-hmm. What was the power one? Tyranny, was it?
Tyranny.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
tyranny.
what is his word for that rule or system of rule that serves at most the good?
Yeah, he calls the city that's oriented that way the Kallipolis,
Oh,
Kallipolis. And polis is Greek for city. And, he's not talking about giant nation states the way we think of nowadays. He's thinking of cities because that's how the Greeks lived at the time. And
yeah.
the Kallipolis, kalos is beauty or fineness.
Yeah.
So the Kallipolis is the beautiful city.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ideal constitution. Utopia,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes he doesn't use that word, but that's one way in which we could refer to it.
We have examples of honor cultures, wealth-oriented cultures, freedom-oriented cultures, power-oriented cultures. Do you have an example of a good-oriented culture, historically speaking?
A good oriented culture.
Would that be
I'm not endorsing
Christendom?
this. What's
Oh,
that?
Christendom? Christendom? Medieval Christendom?
Yeah, I mean, if we can speak as scholars
Christendom.
here, where we're not saying we think that they have the actual good, but merely that they're structured that way,
Oh,
then yes, I would say sort of Christian monarchies would be an example. I was going to use an example from today, namely the Islamic theocracy in Iran, where you have the elite clerical class who are like the philosopher kings, and then you have the Republican Guard, who are the second class, and then you have the rest of the
Hmm.
society. And that's how Plato structured his utopia was the philosopher kings, the soldiers who follow the orders of the philosopher kings, and they're tightly unified, those two classes, very small minority, and then the rest of the society. And it's not an accident because Ayatollah Khomeini modeled the Islamic Republic of Iran on Plato's Republic.
And you're not endorsing it.
I'm not endorsing it. No,
Okay.
I didn't think you were asking me for. Do I think that there's actually been in my
Yeah.
system of value? I'm
But it's
not. I'm
close.
not.
Yeah.
So for me, that's not the ideal city.
Well, are you interested in implementing an ideal city?
No,
No.
no,
Not personally, or seeing it implemented in the great experiment that
no,
could be the federal United States
no. I'm not.
federated.
No, I mean
Yeah.
Plato tried and it failed. I mean
Okay.
he famously tried to educate a king of Sicily to make him into. He was a young king and tried to educate him into becoming a philosopher king, and he ended up having to run away, run off the island with arrows flying over his shoulders, and escape with his life.
Hmm. Why
So
does that
Plato
happen
couldn't pull it
to
off.
Why does that happen to all good philosophers?
What happened?
Why does that happen to all good philosophers getting run out of town with arrows flying
Oh
over their
yeah.
shoulder?
Um, well, take Socrates as the famous example, Plato's teacher. His job was to take care of the souls of Athens. That's how he describes himself in the Apology, his trial. So yeah, as your listeners know, he was executed for ostensibly for worshiping unusual gods and for corrupting the youth. And he's in his defense explaining how did he get to this point? Like, why do people think that he's corrupting the youth, even though he's improving them? And why do they think that he's not worshiping the gods of the city when in fact he's saying I'm worshiping them in the true way? Because he thinks Apollo gave him this mission to care for the souls of the Athenians. Well, his understanding of caring for the souls is, and here I'll blend it with Plato's cave again, coming down into the cave and rattling them so that they don't any longer believe in the images that they've taken to be real. So the values that they've held all their lives, he thinks, are not well grounded. They're fake. And thus he asks these difficult questions. And he asked the difficult questions of famous people in front of large crowds in the marketplace. And so he humiliated people and made enemies and uh, powerful enemies who eventually brought him to court and tried him and had him executed.
Hmm.
But yeah, why does that happen to philosophers? Well, the lesson is people don't like the truth.
Even academia or academics.
Yeah, even. I wouldn't say even, I would say especially.
Whoa. Okay. Why do you think? Why do you think they're so concerned with things other than truth, beauty,
Yeah,
goodness?
yeah. Well, academia is an extremely conformist environment. I mean, I think all institutions are conformist to an extent that you have to have a certain type to perpetuate an institution, and you have practices that make sure that that type reoccurs in each generation. But
Hmm.
think about the trajectory to become a professor. So you do your 4 years in college, and you can't write too many papers that go outside the Overton window, or else you'll get bad grades. So you've got to at least, and again, writing papers is somewhat obsolete, but I'm describing an experience that
Hmm.
was common until pretty recently. I'm sure there's going to be an equivalent now, but at any rate, you write whatever 20, 30 papers, and they can't go too far outside the window, and nor can the opinions that you express in class and so on. And you get a pat on the head for the comfortable opinions that the professors want to hear. So then you get into graduate school, which is very difficult if you don't do that. And then the same process happens again, but in a much more rigorous fashion, because now you're not, one of thousands of undergraduates, but you are in a department where, you're five of the entering class, and you're being trained to become a professional, and you're heavily scrutinized. And graduate school has many stages, each of which this may not be the explicit purpose, but it has the result that you are vetted for not taking risks, not offending. And think about the to graduate finally from a PhD program, you have to write a book, dissertation, and then you have to defend it in front of a committee of 5 or 6 people. And well, the romantic idea is, you write the revolutionary book that transforms the field and reorients it towards truth and so on. Yeah, well, these are 5 people who have their careers already invested in the idea that you're trying to shatter, if that were, the fantasy. And they're not going to see it as, oh yeah, this young person has just taught me that my entire career has been based on a falsehood. It's going to be, no, you haven't read these articles, and you haven't really plumbed the depths of my monograph, and so on. And so, I've seen it many times. Independent thinkers either being canceled in the academy quite explicitly, or just falling away because they realize this isn't a place where I can think freely and be rewarded for that. And that's just the beginning. I mean, and I should have emphasized that the statistics of getting into these places, so getting into the kind of undergraduate program that will then get you into the graduate program that will get you a job where you're going to be one candidate among 200 applicants and so on. There's just a perpetual sieve, so that by the time somebody gets tenure, even if they had a dream of eventually being an iconoclast, they've had to habituate themselves to conformity for, by that point, 15, 20 years. It's going to be very hard to rediscover that revolutionary spirit.
Mm-hmm. And then the academy, which is still filled with people who style themselves as iconoclasts, find something outside of the academy to launch their slings and arrows at, perhaps.
Yeah, tell me what you're referring to. I have an idea, but I'm not sure it's the same as yours.
I don't know. I was just saying, like, why are they all so freaking angry at Trump? Because he's because they need something to break. They need something to go against, but they can't go against each other too far.
Right.
What was your trajectory through that gauntlet?
Through academia? So I was pretty conventional until quite recently. So, I didn't have to play that game that some play where they hide their opinions for a long time and then eventually they get tenure and they come out with them. I think that my opinions that challenge the orthodoxy, the basic faith of the academy and of its politics and so on, those developed slowly so that I was able to get through each hurdle without either betraying opinions that would have jeopardized that or even hiding opinions that would have jeopardized that. So, I went to a good college. I got into a good graduate program.
What field?
Philosophy and classics.
Okay.
Those are my two.
In that order or reversed?
Well, I mean, if you want to know, the undergrad was a philosophy degree, a BA, and then I did an MA in philosophy. Then I did an MA in classics, and then in Greek particularly, and then a PhD in philosophy. And along the way, I did a 4-year degree in psychoanalysis. I was thinking of becoming a psychoanalyst, which I haven't practiced, but it's certainly informed the way I think about a lot of things. So yeah, I don't want to bore you with my
no, that's trajectory. The meat of the conversation, actually.
Okay, all right. Well, to try to answer your question, maybe too vaguely about how did I grapple with this? I didn't really have opinions that challenged the orthodoxy of the academy until after I had tenure. And even then, I've been able to pose those challenges by not speaking in my own voice, but instead by doing scholarship on figures who have very unorthodox, challenging opinions. And Nietzsche is the best example, where I just teach a class on Nietzsche where I say, this is what Nietzsche says. And that's the point of scholarship, is you are true to what the text says. But Nietzsche challenges the main pieties of modern society. So you have a choice when you teach Nietzsche or talk about Nietzsche in the academy. You can be true to what he's saying, or you can sugarcoat him and make him conform. And Since the Second World War, in America, most Nietzschean, they're not Nietzscheans actually, they're people who talk about Nietzsche in the academy, they choose the sugarcoating route. And I don't even think it's deliberate. I just think that they're not noticing the passages and the thoughts that truly challenge the orthodoxies. And so, they've read the work of their teachers and then they teach that to their students and so on. So you have this kind of fake Nietzsche that gets circulated in the academy, and you have the real Nietzsche um, of the texts themselves. And this real Nietzsche, as I'm describing him, I think the quicker way to get to that real Nietzsche, if you want a commentator, is outside the academy. So someone that you're probably familiar with, Bronze Age Pervert, he was very helpful to me for seeing what Nietzsche's actually saying. And of course, it was crucial that he was saying those things outside the academy because of the economy of ideas that I just described, where they're the recirculated orthodox Nietzsche, which is a fake Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm. Can we explore this a little bit?
Yeah.
Can I pose it? Can I pose a question?
Please.
What's the difference between post-World War II Nietzsche and the other one?
Okay. Well, the simplest way to state it is that, the United States and the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And
go communists.
Especially in the West, but also in the Soviet sphere, the regimes that were established were anti-fascist regimes, anti-Nazi regimes. And, the Nuremberg trials, really symbolizing that. That's sort of the beginning of this post-war regime.
Can we dig into that? Can you tell me what the purpose and the result of the Nuremberg trials are?
Well,
as though I wouldn't know.
Oh, well, I'm not an expert on the Nuremberg trials, so I don't want to pretend
from a cultural critique point of view, what do you think they symbolized, or what the process of denazification was?
Yeah. Well, the Westphalian model of the 19th century of the relationships between states, where each state is a sovereign in its own territory and respects the sovereignty of other states in their territory. And occasionally there are wars between states, but they have, finite goals. And then once it's over, the goal is peace and the sovereignty of the nation is respected and so on. Very different idea from total war, where the idea is we're going to annihilate that system, that, we don't respect the sovereignty of that state. When we defeat them in war, we demand unconditional surrender because we're going to rewrite the rules of their society. I'm not saying that never occurred in history before. You can see that in the American Civil War with Sherman's March to the South, for example, and Reconstruction. But, you get this on a global scale after the Second World War. And as I said, the Nuremberg trials epitomize this, where the victorious powers are not recognizing the sovereignty of Nazi Germany by saying, all right, you surrendered, the war's over. Here are the boundaries that we're now redrawing, and you remain sovereign within your territory. No, it's that we're going to, as you say, denazify your entire regime, and we're going to take a code of ethics, of legality, and impose it on you, and say you broke our rules. And the novelty of that, or the shock of that, is obvious to anyone who might contemplate being on the losing side of such a war, where, let's say, the war with Iran continues and escalates, and Iran turns out to be much more powerful than Trump imagined and conquers us, and then say, you broke the rule, to the leaders of the United States, you broke the rules of the Muslim world, and we're going to punish you according to Muslim laws. That would be not respecting the sovereignty of our state, which, people actually have a hard time thinking of that anymore, because since the Second World War, there's been this idea of international human rights, which are supposed to stand above conflicts. And if a nation doesn't respect those international human rights, then they've lost their right to sovereignty and can be punished criminally, not just punished, the way Sherman punished the South, where I'm going to destroy you because I want to win. It's that, no, you've committed crimes, and so we're going to take you to court, and try you in courts according to rules that we wrote. But this isn't idiosyncratic because these are universal human rights. So, that's what I'm referring to with the Nuremberg trials. I don't know much more about it
Okay.
than
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
I'm not
Yeah.
presenting myself as an expert in Second World War or in the denazification and so on. And I forget how we got into this. Oh, Nietzsche.
Yeah.
That you've got this regime that really starts in 1945 that identifies itself as an anti-fascist regime. Whatever they were, we're not that. And Nietzsche, as a result, since he's got a lot of fascistic elements, in other words, this idea that the Nazis totally misunderstood Nietzsche is not true. I'm not saying that they got him entirely right, but they got things out of him that are there. And so when Nietzsche was introduced to this post-World War II regime, it was only going to work in one of two ways. One is like, here is what this terrible regime that we've defeated, that we stand against in all of our basic concepts, thinks. And then you sort of treat Nietzsche as this boogeyman that you bring up every once in a while to whip, or you Baudelarize him and you just leave out those passages and you emphasize other ones that are more seem like they go along with the post World War II Western regime, and that's what happened. And in fact, the translator and the guy who
Kaufman.
created the editions that normalized Nietzsche in the United States, Kaufman, he did that. He left out passages and he mistranslated things. So in his case, I think it was deliberate, but I think
He probably had a bit of a ethnic beef with the German people at that point when he was involved in that particular endeavor.
Exactly. Yeah. So by now, I think that, and when I say by now, I'll say, let's say by 2023, 2024, there had been so many generations of Nietzsche scholars having students, becoming teachers, having new students and so on. I don't think they were aware any longer that this Nietzsche that they were teaching wasn't the actual Nietzsche. But I think it's changed. I think people like Bronze Age Pervert are reviving this actual Nietzsche, and it's seeping back into the academy. And I think I've seen people in the academy, not close friends or anything, but I'm just observing what they say on Facebook posts or whatever. And they're like, hey guys, Nietzsche's actually a fascist. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching him, which is a complete reversal because, the Nietzsche that I was introduced to in the, early 90s when I went to college was the postmodern Nietzsche who, deconstructs Christianity and allows us to, et cetera, et cetera. It was the French Nietzsche of the 1968 generation of philosophers, who used him for their purposes. But I think the authentic Nietzsche is rising from the grave. And I predicted, when I really started seeing this, which was 2023, I predicted Nietzsche had 10 more years left to be taught in the universities before he's banned.
So what are some of the aspects of Nietzsche that are characteristic or that show us what parts of Nietzsche that were taught in the years following World War II up to the revival of a pre-World War II Nietzsche? What are some of the ways that he's been taught describe or show us what this regime is? Let's try to take a walk out of the cave by using Nietzsche. Like how has Nietzsche been taught that shows us what that particular regime is? And I don't follow so far with there's a reality we're going to merge into. It's a nice metaphor, but I think it's important just to see it as a system. So you do have to step out of it to see it. And it's really hard for us to do, but maybe by seeing Nietzsche and then seeing this other Nietzsche, we can start to see the regime that what it is.
Sure. So I think
you hinted at it with the postmodernism, the deconstructing of Christianity stuff.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to come at it from another angle. We can go back to that element, but I think it'll be clear if I start where I'm about to start, if it's okay with you. So I'd say the passage that anyone who wants to see what I'm talking about immediately should read is Genealogy of Morality, first essay, aphorism 5. It's a page and a half. And I'll describe, what it says in a moment. But, if you want to do your own research, it would be Genealogy of Morality, essay 1, aphorism 5. Aphorisms, you might think of aphorism as like a line, a sentence or whatever, like Heraclitus, but Nietzsche has this thing where he's got these sections. It can be a page and a half long, and the scholars call them aphorisms for whatever reason.
He's such a fun read. He's
Oh
so
yeah,
fun to read. He's so fun to read.
yeah. I mean, not to get off track, but I want to endorse that and say that he's really the only author I have ever read where I like it has spiritual effects on me while I'm reading it. And by spiritual, I don't mean like, you know, obviously he's anti-clerical, so I don't mean that. What I mean is it affects my soul so that like it energizes it at the very least, it energizes me. I feel like something's happening inside me. It's not purely intellectual when I'm reading Nietzsche. It's like my body feels different. Not every time that I read Nietzsche, but I've
Mhm.
experienced that. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a kind of, I'll just put it this way. I get a vitality when I read Nietzsche. Um, and again, not to get too sidetracked, but this is important to me. Um, I have a friend. We haven't seen each other in years, but he's probably the world's greatest Nietzsche scholar. In my opinion, he is. His name is Paul Loeb. I would recommend you interview him. He's also on the West Coast, although he's moved to Hawaii in the meantime. But anyway,
Poor guy.
we were having dinner. It's about 10 years ago. And I was a dyed-in-the-wool Platonist at the time, but I respected Nietzsche and I taught him. And he was a Nietzschean and still is, but he respected Plato. And so we were kind of playing like, who's the better philosopher? And he put a challenge to me, and I have not been able to respond to this adequately. So he won. He said, find me a boring passage in Nietzsche. And, I've read nearly all of it, and I cannot find a boring passage. Every single one enlivens me. Of course, we all lose track when we're reading and get
Yeah.
sleepy and so on. But like when I'm
Zarathustra is hard to
concentrating,
get through for me. That's the one that's been
okay,
it's hard to
yeah,
get through.
that would be the one. Yeah, that would be the one. But there's nothing like at that moment I was a partisan of Plato, and like there
Mm.
are long passages in the Parmenides where like you just cannot find your way, and it's boring. So anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, I was going to tell you about genealogy and morality 1:5. Nietzsche presents an anthropology in that passage. And the anthropology is this, that there was a people, I won't name them for the moment, because I don't want to catalyze the reaction that will inevitably come. But there was a people who conquered a vast swath of territory thousands of years ago, from Ireland all the way to India. And Nietzsche's not working with archaeological evidence because the science of archaeology hadn't been born yet, at least not in
He's
a way
using
that he could
philology.
access. What's that?
He's using philology.
He's using philology, exactly, and he's a master philologist. And so
It's the study of languages and words and the
yeah,
roots of them. Yeah.
that's right. And, it was known by that point, it had been discovered in the late 18th century that there was a family of languages that I think two-fifths of the world's population at that time spoke. And it's probably still that included Sanskrit and ancient Greek and Gaelic and Latin and the Germanic languages, and I could go on. There's a whole huge family tree of these languages.
How
Go
far
ahead.
south did it go? Off the top of your head, if you know.
So into India.
Okay. No, Africa necessarily? Probably
No, no, it
northern
never went.
Africa.
They never went into Africa.
So
They stretched.
Arabic is different.
That's right.
It's
Yeah, I
pretty
don't
separate.
think I don't think Arabic is part of this family of languages, and I don't want to tease, but well, I'll tell you the name. I'll tell you one name for them. The polite name is Indo-European.
Oh, I
So
thought you were going to use
family
the.
of languages. What's that?
I thought you were going to use the other name.
I will, but I don't want to catalyze the reaction just yet because we need to use the other name because remember, this is all nested within our conversation of what happened to Nietzsche after the Second World War. So there's this family of languages, the Indo-European languages, and the word for mother is very, very similar in many of them, and you can trace them all back to a language that no longer exists, but that we can, to some extent, reconstruct, and it's called Proto-Indo-European. So PIE. The people who spoke it are then abstractly called the PIEs or the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And now that we have archaeological evidence and anthropological evidence and so on, and genetic evidence, crucially, we're able to identify, regions where these people came from. And there's still some debate, and I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I think probably the most consensus candidate is roughly Ukraine. The Caucasus Mountains. Those are different regions, but they're not that specific. And the Yamnaya, they're sometimes called. I think that's a Russian word for them. Again, it's not my specialty, but these people, these Proto-Indo-Europeans, mastered horses, and as a result of chariots and horseback riding, they were able to conquer, this huge amount of territory. And as I say, we have genetic evidence now that links some burials in Mongolia with the genetic material in Western Europe. And it can, through the techniques that they've mastered in the meantime, they can identify that, these people were like fifth cousins. So it's not like it took 600 or 700 years for this expansion to happen, but this happened within several generations. These were a master race in the sense that they mastered other people. Okay, well, again, the word that Nietzsche uses, that was used until the Second World War for these people, was the Aryans. And Arya is a word in one of those, well, in that language, I gather. Again, it's not my specialty, but it means, I believe, wealth or power or substance or something like that. So they called themselves the Aryans, the men of power, the men of wealth, the men of substance. And again, the word might mean all three, and I could be getting things slightly wrong, but you're getting the picture. Mm-hmm. And Nietzsche describes moral vocabulary in these languages from 2,000-3,000 years ago, 2,000. Of course, you got to wait for there to be textual evidence, but Homer's a very good example. It's the one that he knows the best. And that's an Aryan culture in the sense that it has the language and the values similar to other ancient epics that you get out of India, for example. Mm-hmm. So in the moral vocabulary of these ancient Aryan societies, the notion of being good is being strong, being healthy, being powerful, being wealthy. And to be bad is to be not those things. It's to be weak. It's to be poor, and so on. So Nietzsche notices in this long, well, it's not actually long, it's Genealogy Morale, it's a pretty short book, but longer than a page and a half. Yeah. He notices that moral vocabulary of the Aryans gets inverted in the Mediterranean in the first century AD by Christianity. Well, I think it starts with the Jews, but it doesn't get going in terms of conquering those Aryan ways of thinking until Christianity is adopted by the Roman Empire. And he sees that as the Jews defeating Rome. So Rome defeats the Jews famously in 70 AD when they destroy the temple. But in Nietzsche's story, the Jews get their revenge on Rome by putting one of their own in Rome as the Pope. And in Nietzsche's understanding, the Christians and the Jews are working on the same project. In fact, he thinks that Jesus was the ultimate Jewish trick because the Romans thought, hey, if the Jews reject him, then if we accept him, we're not going along with the Jews. So anyway, the inversion that happens that you can see in Christianity is that to be weak, to be meek, is to be good, and to be too worldly, to be too powerful, to be too wealthy, and so on, that's evil. So Nietzsche's doing a somewhat complicated trick here. He's saying there was this new set of values that was created as the antithesis of the old Aryan values. And these new set of values are these Jewish values. through the ruse of Christianity, and they are a negation of Aryan values. So that the Aryans were, independent. They didn't think about the Jews or anybody else. They were just conquering the world, and they thought we're the good people, and everybody else is the bad, and we're the rich, and we're the strong, and we're the healthy, and we're the powerful, and so on. And they didn't think about the people they were conquering. By contrast, the Jews who were being enslaved by these Aryans, the Romans, they thought those are evil people. We are resentful of them, and our values are the inversion of their values. So if in their system to be strong and powerful and wealthy and so on, if that's good, well, that's going to be evil in our system. And we're good because we're not that. And so, this now we're back to your original question, which is what happened to Nietzsche after the Second World War. That passage gets overlooked, let's just say. It's not in, when the genealogy of morality gets excerpted and puts in readers for students and so on, it's left out.
But they'll leave in everything that slags on Christianity.
So, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so just to tie a bow on it, you can see how if the post-World War II regime is we are not the fascists. We are not those people, the Nazis who were pro-Aryan and were anti-Semitic. A passage by this philosopher that's saying the Aryans are the master race and Christianity is a Jewish trick that the Jews used to conquer Rome. If you include that and you teach that, you're teaching the basis of Nazi ideology. As I said, you could either do that and say, that'd be like reading Mein Kampf regularly, saying like, we're going to read this, but this is not us. Or you could just leave that out and try and create another Nietzsche that, and that's when I present that passage to people who are willing to have this conversation, who care about Nietzsche and maybe even teach Nietzsche, they think, well, that's not that important. You can leave that out and talk about these other things. And yeah, sure, with any philosopher, you can leave stuff out and do creative things. Like I've seen people leave the forms out of Plato and say kind of interesting things about Plato, but it's not really Plato. They're just appropriating it to do their own things. Well, similarly, by leaving that passage out of the genealogy of morality, it's right at the beginning. It's like the basis of the story that he's telling. Then you leave out the history, and you can't make sense when he says later in at the very end of the first essay that the fundamental battle of world history is between Rome and Judea, between these two sets of values.
And he pitches it as a battle.
Yeah.
Because other people pitch it as a synthesis between rather Athens and Jerusalem.
Yeah. Other people do. I mean, forgetting Straussian. Who is it that said there's one particular figure was like Athens, Jerusalem, Rome, the great synthesis. The name of the is escaping me at the moment, but yeah, absolutely not. For Nietzsche, there's a complete antithesis between Athens and Rome on the one hand and Jerusalem on the other. He calls it the slave revolt in morality, that the slaves of the Romans, who were downstream of the Greeks, conquered the masters by tricking them with a false morality.
It's so deeply baked into our culture, this Christianity thing. I wonder, how close do you feel to Nietzsche? Would you be able to psychoanalyze him just a little bit to say how Christian was he? How Christian was he?
Yeah.
Even in his anti-Christianity, how Christian was he?
Yeah. He's got a basic Christian narrative arc, if you like. So his dad was a pastor. And, when he was very young, he was attracted to that. And, he gave it up gave up that ambition when he was a teenager. But that narrative arc of Christianity, of the paradise, the fall, the redemption, the salvation, he's got roughly that story for world history, that there was a kind of paradise, if you like, our animal life and our wild life, and that we fell out of that paradise, that animal wild life, into a misunderstanding of time that wasn't accidental. That's what made us humans. So we fell out of animal life with a time where there was a time consciousness, that was indifferent to the passage of time in the way that, animals seem oblivious to, how long, how bored, how long we get bored. They don't get bored so much.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a different story. The point is that humans fell into this false understanding of time, and that we've been on this, downward slide for however many thousands of years, and that he thinks there's going to be a redeemer who will teach us the proper understanding of time. That's Zarathustra, that book that you were bored by. He's going to teach us the eternal return, and we'll return to the paradise, but in now as human beings. So anyway, to answer that question, yeah, that's a basically Christian story. And that's why he chooses Zarathustra as his hero. He thinks this is a pre-Christian, we need a redeemer who's pre-Christian.
Yeah, we need a Nietzsche that's pre-World War II. But Zarathustra, his idea, it's not Malthusianism, is it? There's like this pitch battle, like this really strong dichotomy, right? Zarathustra, that whole religion is about Zoroastrianism.
So Zoroaster is the Greek. That's how the Greeks spelled and said the name Zarathustra, which is, I guess, I don't speak the relevant language, but Zarathustra, I guess, is a more authentic pronunciation of what that guy's actual name was. Zoroaster is the Greek appropriation of that name. And then Zoroastrianism is that religion based on that figure and, of course, the tradition of Zoroastrianism. So when I think of Zoroastrianism, I think of dualism.
Yeah, dualism.
There are two gods. Ahura Mazda is the good one, I think, and I forget the name of the bad one. And they're battling over the nature of the world. Manichaeanism, I think, is downstream from this as well. And so, what has Nietzsche got in mind when he picks Zarathustra as his mouthpiece? I don't think it's a dualism of, thinking of the world as a battle between good and evil.
Well, he does frame things in terms of inversion. He is using a very dialectical, or at least a diatribe, like these two polar opposites, Rome versus what?
Judea.
Judea.
Yeah.
As an aside, Iran's etymology comes from Aryan, and it's interesting that we're in a war that our government said Israel kind of pushed us into. So there's that, there's this tension that shows up linguistically even now between these two regimes. And it's interesting. I think part of the reason why, in the wake of World War II, your cohort or your clade, the academics, shy away from that passage that you brought up from Genealogy and Morals is because he's stressing the gene. He's stressing inheritance, blood.
That's right.
That's one of everything that you describe. And what's really the most interesting part of the discourse in the dissident sphere, which is the non-regime sphere. And that sphere of discourse is constantly falling into drama. It's constantly denigrating itself by pettiness and ego, which is fine, but there is this attempt to get to a Christianity that's strong because people are aware that liberalism has weakened everybody. And there's something in Christianity that does have a strength to it. So it's an interesting kind of attempt I see where there is this through oddly enough, through orthodoxy, this attempt to get to a Nietzschean Christianity, which praises strength, which is a hard thing for modern Americans to internalize with regard to Christianity, because we think Christianity is just like liberalism 1.0, right? That it all led to us, and now we're woke, we're progressive, we're progressing. And Christianity had some good ideas, but it was basically this bigoted religion, and we need to grow and flourish. So it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting things that you're bringing up.
Yeah. So many things to say about that. Let's see if I remember them. One is that, just back to Nietzsche for the moment, in this passage that I allude to, where he starts by saying, our history, the history of our civilization is the battle between Rome and Judea. He gives a very quick history of the modern period, and he presents the left. He names the movement: socialism, feminism, liberalism, he includes anarchism in that list. He sees those as successors to Christianity, not accidentally, but essentially. He thinks that Christianity by the 19th century has exhausted what it was able to achieve. And in his mind, that's the slave revolt in morality, that it started the slave revolt in morality in Rome, and the Roman Empire became Christian, but that by the 19th century, in order to keep going along that line, in order to liberate more slaves, it had to pass the torch to these movements. And so he doesn't see, two battles that ideological battles that characterize the 19th century. One is science versus Christianity. The other is these left-wing movements and Christianity, especially the Catholic Church. One trick of Nietzsche is that he doesn't see those as battles. He sees those as successions, that science is taking over one thing that Christianity did, and it's doing it even better than Christianity did, and the left is taking over this other facet. And that you get a combination of the left and science that he thinks is the new religion of Europe. He thinks it's a nihilistic religion. He thinks this Judean model was always nihilistic in the very precise sense that its identity was a negation of something else, that it was never interested in promoting itself. It just resented these other people and just wanted to annihilate them. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other that I can remember is that having taught Nietzsche in the universities for 20 years or more now, I find it's always my Christian students who get him the best. And they understand what he's saying, even when they disagree. Whereas, the typical atheist students, the ones that you might think, especially based on the 1968 Nietzsche that was, popularized by the French, you might think they're going to resonate with Nietzsche. On the contrary, they usually don't understand like this what he's saying about Christianity. They don't feel, anger about it or identity with it. It's just sort of part of the background of things that Nietzsche said. It's not only, however, that the Christian students I've had get him, and sometimes get him and then want to argue against him. For example, I had a monk. Well, he wasn't a monk at the time. He finished his BA, wrote a thesis with me on how Nietzsche got Christianity wrong, and then he went off to a monastery in Arizona. And as a footnote, he gave up all his worldly possessions to me, which was like 3,000 Pokemon cards. I don't play Pokemon, but I gave them to my 5-year-old son. It was like,
that's so adorable.
About paradise.
That's the highlight of the whole episode. That's so beautiful.
Yeah,
I think that shows a part of Christianity that I was going to get to, but go on.
Yeah, well, the only other thing I was going to say along that line is that the most interesting response of the Christians that I've seen, and I'm talking about students here, is that they think they fight against Nietzsche for a long time, and then something clicks, and they think, you know what, he's right about bad Christianity. And that they see him as a kind of Jeremiah, namely, this is a critic of Christianity who's trying, maybe not trying, but could be achieving the effect of purifying Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so what you were saying about a certain American attraction to Orthodox Christianity, maybe something like that, mm-hmm. That Nietzsche can be used as a bridge. I've seen it happen several times.
No, it's rooted in the strength, the component of strength that bad Christianity or Unitarian, Quaker, liberal Christianity, whatever it is that the regime is, that doesn't even call itself Christian anymore. I mean, right. That flag, they have this flag. It's got like all these colors on it.
Yeah, I've seen it around. Like
it's a weird inversion of. It's a very weird, odd inversion of an ancient parable about how God destroyed the world because it was descending into decadence, and then allowed some people to survive and gave a sign to his prophet that survived of a rainbow to promise that he would always watch after the righteous. But then they added the chevron with all these different other identities into it.
In 2020, yeah. And it didn't make any sense to me at the time. It just seemed like, oh, well, Black Lives Matter is popular, so we're going to add that too. But it's stuck, and I think it's stuck because it's coherent. I think it's a negative identity. And to understand what holds those stripes on that flag together, the chevron and the, is just think about what's not on there. There's no white stripe.
There is, but it's actually transition. It's
Yeah,
actually the mutilation of children,
yeah. So what I meant
specifically
by,
white affluent children. Oddly
yeah,
enough,
interesting. I didn't. I mean, as I said that, I was like, yeah, there is a white stripe, but it's not there to say whites are part of this coalition. I guess maybe, as you say, unless they transition their kids. I don't know.
no. That's the only way for a straight heterosexual person of a certain age to achieve identity with that group is to denounce their birth sex.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Which would explain. I mean, this is a complicated phenomenon. Of course, I'm not saying this is the explanation, but it would explain. It's a hypothesis for why trans identification among teens, went up so steeply in 2020.
Yeah,
Crested in 2022, and it's been coming down
yeah.
precipitously since then as well. So it was clearly a trend, and the hypothesis that I'm entertaining as a result of what you're saying is that part of that trend was the effort to escape the whiteness.
Flee the whiteness. So there's several different dangers with breaking from the regime. Destabilizes the regime. The regime is keeping, even if it's a decadent order, it's an order. And that order has two basic principles. One, it keeps things kind of static in a way that's predictable. And then also it rewards you. If you play the game, you get rewards, right? You get the toys, you win the prizes by playing the game. To start to question the regime starts to tick off a lot of people. And even questioning, I won't get too much into my own story, my own trajectory, and where I'm at right now, which is not quite that good of a place, because I started asking questions about certain people you shouldn't ask questions about, because they're very tenacious with protecting their particular identity politic, even if they'll be against all identity politics,
Right.
especially in this day and age. But to start to bring up that genealogy, and maybe Bronze Age Pervert would be a great thing to talk about now. A thinker in his book, Bronze Age Mindset, but just to zero in on that passage that you say is either occluded or overlooked or exempted from the canon of teaching Nietzsche. A return to identity. You can play identity politics fine as long as you're not proud in a certain way, right? To wake a white racial consciousness, to reawaken, or to even be attracted to Europe before World War II, and to say that was the peak of society. It's supremacist, right? It's rendered. That's the fascism that is dangerous, that led to undeniably atrocious actions by the Nazis, right? So how do we square that strength, that Nietzsche, with a world order that one casts it as literal Satan, which can only last for so long, but there is all this danger. There's literal genocide lurking there, or potentially lurking there. And probably not genocide, because the strong people don't want to wipe out the weak people, because then who would they compare themselves to? So there's got to be a way to thread that particular needle. But there's a lot of dangerous things, rather. Not bad, but dangerous things by reawakening that. So how do we go back to that? How do you interact with the pre-World War II Nietzsche, having learned from World War II, perhaps some lessons that even Nietzsche wasn't himself aware of?
Okay. Well, I mean, one thing one would have to do first would be tell the truth about World War II. I think there are a lot of myths about World War II, but I'm not here to, rewrite the story of World War II. But I would say if we're going to have that conversation seriously, one has to first decide what actually happened in World War II. I think we had this regime since 1945 that has created a myth about World War II to sustain itself, both ideologically and ideologically so that it can keep the whole thing together. But the bigger question there that, in other words, that would just be a bog that we would get trapped in. So I'm going to go around the bog and
Mm.
say, how can we redeem Nietzsche? If he needs to be redeemed, how can we redeem him? Or, how can we use Nietzsche in the present century? That's a question that is very interesting to me, and I'm happy to speak about.
Hmm.
One thing that he says that is chilling is that the next 200 years, and he's writing in 1887, so 2087 will be the terminus of this period that he's talking about. The next 200 years will be the great drama of European civilization. I'm not able to quote it word for word, but the most terrible, but also the most full of hope. So he's predicting something that I think at least the most terrible part we can agree happened. In other words, like whatever our final narrative about World War II is, I think we can all agree it was really, really terrible. And that the 20th century was full of genocides and thermonuclear detonations and firebombing of cities and so on. The most terrible got started, certainly, and I don't think it stopped, but he thinks that this crisis of the next 200 years, from his perspective, is a crisis of meaning, and that the convulsions that he foresees, that we've seen, definitely in the 20th century, those are convulsions of the effort to replace the dead God. So take communism, for example. Obviously, communism existed in his lifetime, and there were communist revolutions even in his youth, but that, the Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen until 17 years after he died. I think he foresees it. I think he sees, when he talks about socialism, feminism, liberalism, and so on, he thinks, okay, these are successors to Christianity. These are efforts to give life meaning in the wake of the death of God. And by the way, that phrase, the death of God, he thinks that, the Christian God has died, by which he means that certainly the elites don't believe it any longer. It's not hooked up with science in the way that it was, let's say, in the 13th century. There's been a breaking apart, so that belief in the Christian God is not sustaining the culture the way it had, let's say, up to the 18th century. In the wake of that, you're going to have substitutes. Societies have to be held together by something, and there are only two paths. Either you're going to have a substitute like, say, equality, such as you get in communism. So what do you do when you found Soviet Russia? The idea is, well, everybody's going to be equal. Oh, wait a second. There are people who have more than others, like the kulaks, and there's just no way to break their system unless we break them. So how about we starve them? How many died? 8 million, and that's before the Second World War even started. So
bring him right back to Ukraine again.
Yeah.
Where the whole thing started.
He thinks that those terrible convulsions are going to come from these substitute gods that are going to cause revolutions in which millions are going to die and whole races might be exterminated. But the alternative to that is no meaning at all. And he calls that phenomenon the last man. So he imagines a man, the last man, who lives life without any meaning. And that's not sustainable for somebody who's feeling the death of God, who's feeling like, well, I was in love with this being who, gave me purpose and promised me salvation and so on, without narcotics, literal narcotics. So when he describes the last man, it's the the draining of energy, so that the kind of convulsions that are one symptom of the 20th century, like the Communist Revolution or Nazi Germany, the alternative, which is, I think, what we get in the post-war regime, is, okay, well, we've seen that. We're not going to do that. So we're going to instead have this, bourgeois capitalist regime of comfort and consumerism that you see, celebrated in the 50s. Like Khrushchev comes over and in the kitchen debate and says, "Wow, you got these washing machines." Of Nixon's, I think, the one who's saying, "We've got these washing machines," and so on. And Khrushchev's banging his fist. I'm probably conflating different episodes. Banging his fist and talking about the social justice of the. At any rate, the promise of the Western powers was, we're gonna keep you comfortable, and we're gonna give you televisions, and we're going to give you prescriptions. Again, I'm trying to match up things that people recognize as features of our society with things Nietzsche says about the last man. He says he needs a little poison to go to sleep at night and a lot of poison at the end of his life. So he's talking about euthanasia will become a phenomenon, and regular use of drugs will be a phenomenon as well, a feature of the society. And when you think about the combination of both illegal drugs and prescription drugs in the society, and this really struck me during the pandemic. Oh, I'm sorry about that. This really struck me during the pandemic, at least in my state. You remember what it was like, where we were supposed to shelter in place, and it was illegal to go outside and go to church and so on. But in this state, they kept the liquor stores open. And I was shocked at the time, but I thought, well, I've since learned that alcoholics, if they don't get alcohol, they will die. It's one of the only drugs that it's not just that withdrawal is painful, that if you go cold turkey, if you're too far in your addiction to alcohol, you will die. And heroin, you won't die. It'll be very difficult, but you won't die. That's what I'm told at any rate. So at any rate, I think that says something about our society. We had to keep the alcohol distributors open, but the churches were closed. So back to the Nietzschean story, you were asking me what's the value of Nietzsche for the 21st century. I think his prophecy was correct. And I think he presents us with clear options. One is these substitute gods. I think, I guess what I'm trying to do is pick up from what you were saying and say, I agree with you that that's been exhausted. I think we've seen the dangers of that. The alternative is the last man. I think that's what's expiring now. I think Gen Z especially is living in the wasteland of that. I think, you're younger than I guess you're like late millennial or older millennial.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm Gen X, but I know that you're younger than I am.
What's your birth year?
70.
Oh, okay. I'm just 6 years younger than you. I'm still Gen X. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I always thought of you as a Brett Weinstein student, so I assumed that you were there.
I was older than that, but I was an old student.
Okay.
I have a different relationship to time.
Okay, you're looking good. Well, that's what I'm about to broach.
Yeah.
But before I get to it, I see these generations as as we go deeper into them, living on thinner and thinner fumes. So I think the boomers, the cliche I think is true that most of them are like, what the hell's going on? Life was good. Why are you all going crazy? They don't, Gen X, we're a little cynical about it. But we kind of functioned within their narrative, but we saw some cracks in it.
Yeah.
I have a little hard time understanding millennials, but definitely by the time you get to Gen Z, I think there's just no belief in the narrative any longer. They see the consequences of it. And I think they're vacillating between returning to those false gods. I think you see the rise of socialism, for example, and the kind of fanaticism, but you also see just the cynicism, like the incels, I'm just going to check out and not date, for example. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm rambling, so please.
No. So, like I said, we spoke 9 years ago. Seems like you've evolved or grown as a thinker, as a person. You mentioned that Bronze Age pervert, BAP, which is a lot easier to say. He got you somehow? Was this what was the experience of reading that? Was it kind of Nietzschean and you had a physical reaction or a mental reaction to it, and why?
Well, the physical reaction that I was describing was of reading Nietzsche himself. I've always had, even when, I believed in the false narrative about Nietzsche and so on, there's something visceral about his writing. It's just vitalizing. But the connection that you might be thinking there is that, BAP he probably will reject this characterization, like every characterization people make of him, but he's been considered a vitalist. And so maybe that's what you were thinking, that,
No,
he's,
I was asking, what was your reaction to reading him?
oh, so
And
a lot of
then,
reactions.
yeah.
First of all, I think his podcast is much better than his book. Uh,
Hmm.
so, people haven't been exposed to him. I would say go to the podcast Caribbean Rhythms rather than read the book. Well, not rather than, but I would
Yeah.
say do that first. Um, I think the main thing I would say, we'll say more perhaps, but is that he's a free thinker in the sense that he is not, I believe, he is not saying what he thinks anybody wants to hear. And, he spent a long time as an anon, still officially anon, Bronze Age pervert, but, we all know his name. But at any rate, he's kept that persona, and his online persona was formed as an anon. And one thing about being an anon is that you get to say, whatever you want, and you don't have to worry about the social consequences. You don't have to worry about what people will say about, oh, he said this, he's this kind of person, and so on. So one thing, if you haven't, anyone who's listening hasn't tried being an anon, I recommend it because you take on that anonymous identity and you find it's not that easy to actually be anon. Like you may be officially anonymous, but what I mean by it is that it's hard to give up your habits if you've been formed, as I was for a long time, of just implicitly assuming when I say something, people are going to associate what I say with me. And then once you involve other people in your maybe not your calculation, but your experience of speaking, that affects how you think.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
for what it's worth, I mean, here I'm giving a kind of psychoanalysis by saying that being an anon had to have been part of how he did this. I think there's a lot more to it than that. He's an interesting person in his own right, but that's what's most attractive about him to me is the freedom of thought.
Hmm. But how did he affect or initiate a transition or a phase transition in your own way of thinking?
Well, he put me in touch with this Nietzsche that I described earlier. In other words, the forbidden Nietzsche. So, there are really two thinkers about Nietzsche who have affected my thinking about Nietzsche. One is Bronze Age pervert. I'll return to him in a minute. The other, Paul Loeb, I mentioned. Paul Loeb is the thinker who has taught us that Nietzsche really did believe in the eternal return. And it wasn't just like, oh, he had this doctrine or this kooky doctrine or whatever. He had this defensible doctrine, and it's central to almost everything that he says thereafter. And, he had it in the middle of his career, this insight that time is circular. So, when I think of like the two biggest influences on me as a reader of Nietzsche, the one is what Paul Loeb gave me in understanding the centrality of the eternal return. And the other is from Bronze Age Pervert of basically punching through the Baudelaire's version that I was taught. In other words, disrupting the post World War II fake Nietzsche.
And what is that? What is the essence of this other Nietzsche?
Oh, I think you put your finger on it. Blood, nature, genetics.
Yeah. What do we do with that?
Well, there's so many things you could do with it or not do with it. You could be more specific, but one feature of this post World War II regime is that sometimes it's certainly that there aren't natural differences between groups, that those differences are socially constructed. And in order to achieve, certainly the communist utopia or the liberal utopia, whatever that might be, those differences need to be socially deconstructed. So I think that the rejection of nature, of natural differences especially, and as a result, the rejection of nature in as much as human nature, in as much as it affects politics, is crucial to this regime because without the social construction of all these things, then it can't promise to deconstruct them to achieve the paradise.
Yeah.
It would have to face the fact that there are intransigent differences that
Well,
have to be managed rather than corrected.
within the academy, that is the one aspect of science that is for verboten. And you will get delisted if you follow down that path,
Yeah.
which makes it really well. It's hard for like anybody who's a self-respecting biologist or evolutionary biologist, for that matter, to have a career in academia. But which is interesting when you were talking about earlier about how science took up one aspect of Christianity, and then progressivism, broadly construed,
Sure.
took up the other. Science, those two things like are now breaking apart when it comes to genetics. Like that's the one place where they, of course, have to take Nietzsche out of all the Nietzsche that helps them with either their projects of breaking free of their morality of Christianity, which is interesting because I think that there might be a case to revive Nietzsche specifically to, as you said, redeem Christianity. Not that he would redeem Christ and the message of Christianity, but redeem Christianity from its liberal
Uh,
fallowness.
yeah. Just a little thought there, because you distinguish Christianity from Christ. Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human, I think it's 474, that Christ is the greatest human being who ever lived.
What
Yeah.
are the
Well, the context is he's actually celebrating the Jews. And he says they gave humanity the greatest book, by which I guess he means the Old Testament, and the greatest human being. And I think he also says the greatest philosopher. And it's clear, I believe, that he means Spinoza. But at any rate, for what it's worth, does he actually believe the Old Testament is the greatest book? I'd be
yeah?
amazed. But at any rate,
So there's
I
wiggle room
do think he
between
admires.
Christianity and Christ for him. Yeah. So there's
Yeah,
Jesus, and then there's
yeah,
Christianity.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He despises the New Testament. He thinks it's vulgar. Um, and he thinks it's so if you put that, he says that very clearly. Uh, but if I guess if you were to put that thought together with just this one line, that the idea would be that, Jesus was a great human being, and then he got vulgarized by, as he says, like a fisherman and a tax collector and a carpenter, whatever. It's like these basic, lowlifes appropriated his greatness
Does
for
he
their own.
describe at all his understanding of why Jesus would be a great man? He's not the last man. He's not the Ubermensch. But he's the greatest of humans. So he's the
It's one
paradigm.
line, yeah. It's one
Yeah.
line, and it's in Human All Too Human, which is mid-career. The place to look would be the Antichrist, and I can't recall
Okay.
offhand
Yeah.
what he says about Jesus in particular. He's very critical of St. Paul in that book. Just like I mentioned, he thinks, these degradations of Jesus. So there
Yeah.
there may be passages in that, it'd be worth going
Yeah.
back through and looking for. Does he praise Jesus? Jesus the man.
Do
By
you
the way,
have
you
a?
mentioned Superman. Can I just tie up something from earlier?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So that prophecy, I didn't get quite to the end. He's saying there's going to be this 200 years great drama, terrible crises, and I had just described the terrible crises, which were the substitute gods or the last man. But he also says most rich in hope, and the hope he has is for the Superman. So he thinks after the revolutions, there'll be a choice between the last man and the Superman. And the last man, we could talk about more, but I hope I gave kind of a sense of like we're living that.
Hmm.
And the Superman, has to be recovered. So this is what I would advance as like what should be done, in teaching Nietzsche and writing about Nietzsche and so on, is like, who is the Superman? What is he talking about? I think a couple things are quite clear. The Superman is going to be the person or the group or whatever that lives in an experience of circular time. So just to remind you of that Christian arc that Nietzsche has, we were animals, we weren't really aware of time. Then we fell into time, linear time consciousness. In other words, there's a future out there, there's the past behind us, and we're moving towards the future. And once something goes into the past, it's gone forever. And then what's coming at us is our death when we'll be annihilated. He thinks that experience is inherently resentful because of the offense of death and the offense of the
Sin.
irrevocable past.
Yeah.
Nostalgia is a big thing for him. something I can sympathize with. It's someone who also lost a parent in youth that, there's this feeling like, I can't get back to this good time that I had. It's forever gone. And he seems to have experienced that as well. And he thinks that creates resentment of the world. That if we're really living in a world where once something is past, it's forever gone, especially if somebody's dead, then we're going to hate the world, to put it simply. And that the hatred of the world or resentment of the world impels us to create a fantasy of a world where we won't suffer time, namely heaven. He thinks that, the history of the slave revolt and what he calls the ascetic ideal and all of these movements throughout, they're ultimately expressions of our hatred of the world. And that, just to tie it into that theme about the Aryans are living a worldly life that, they're living, in his estimation, the best life that's available to human beings at that point in history, a life of strength and health and power and wealth, without any guilt. Well, they lost, and we're living in this like final gasps of this ascetic ideal that's expiring, and we're living with the last man. And this Superman, this redeemer, he calls him a redeemer. This actual Christ is probably what he thinks. This Superman will be the one who will no longer experience time as linear, and therefore will escape the resentment that has characterized human beings from the beginning. And so, this is a big topic that I'd be happy to talk about. It's difficult, but a whole other subject.
Name?
What's that?
His name?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to keep that
Donald
secret.
Trump.
The eternal return, it's wacky in a delightful way, but as I say, I think it's defensible. If time really is circular, your past is also your future. So you have your past to look forward to. It eliminates nostalgia immediately.
Is there a revision? It's a very writerly way of thinking. It's actually poetic. So it's actually pre-written word. It's oracular. Because you've written books.
Yeah.
You write a book, and it's not written yet because you have to rewrite it, and then you rewrite it, and then you rewrite it. And there's this way of understanding time that comes to you. It's like, okay, well, maybe next time I'll change that word. I'll do a different inflection. Is it a live loop or is it a dead loop? That's the question.
So false dichotomy. It's a great question, but it's a false dichotomy. So, if you think that, we go around once and we live a certain life, we do certain things. Well, if time really is circular and he thinks everything repeats, it's the eternal return of the same, then it sounds like a dead loop. The second time we go around, we just have to repeat everything. And for many people who are taught this false version, well, that's terrifying, especially if they're unhappy with their lives because, my God, I made these mistakes. Now I've got to make them all over again.
Yeah.
But that's not actually the doctrine because there's no first time around. There have been infinitely, I'm going to speak very loosely here because anyone who challenges me will realize there's a contradiction here, but it'll get the idea. There have been infinitely many loops already, and there will be infinitely many loops in the future. Now, the reason why that's false is there's no past outside of the loops, but it'll do for now. This loop that we're on, it's not that it follows some primal loop, whether it's like 3 loops ago or 1,000 loops or 1,000,000,000,000 loops. This loop that we're on has no greater or lesser position than any other loop. So we're writing all the loops as we're going around this time. And that's why I say it's a false dichotomy. Is it live or dead? It's not dead because we're making this up as we go, but it's not live in the sense that it's already been written and we get to revise it.
I'm getting a sense of something. When I was younger, in my 20s, I had this very acute sense that would happen to me over and over again where it's now. Like right now is now. I'd just be very startled by the fact that it was now.
Yeah.
And here I am. And it seems like that is something that I'm deriving from that, if it boosted me out of the loop, let's say, like where I'm standing on all the loops at once.
Yeah.
And so is it live or dead? It doesn't matter because here I am and I'm still as alive as
Yeah.
I could be. And so deriving the vitality of all of that, standing inside of itself,
Yeah.
it's kind of like like nostril clearing, awakening kind of
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very close to, and I'm not judging it as I have it and you're,
Yeah.
if,
I don't
I'm
know.
struggling with
Yeah.
this idea just as much as you or any of the listeners. I'm not here to
Yeah.
say like I understand it completely, but having thought about it, for 10 or 15 years,
Yeah.
that sounds a lot like when I'm able to appreciate this idea, what I get. And
Hmm.
it's it's the infinity that is the only other thing that I would add, because you could have an experience of it's now and
It's
that's
always been
all.
now.
It's always, yeah, it's always been now, or this is the only now that's this now. I think his experience is, yeah, of this experience you're describing of total immersion in the now, because, for example, you're not like trying to get somewhere else, like heaven, for example, that would make this now somehow just transitory because you're eventually going to get to the place that really matters. There's only this now, but it's got this infinite depth to it. In other words, it's not just one point on this line that's going somewhere. It's one point on this line that's going around to be a circle. So there's a second time and a third time and a fourth. And the numerical sequence also goes -1, -2, -3, -4. In other words, this now has infinite depth and infinite height.
What what would Plato have said about this thing?
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche has a fascinating view of Plato. Um, just if I could just speak about it for like 2 or 3 minutes, because
Yeah.
I think you'll like this. So your listeners are probably familiar with the fact that Socrates was executed, as I mentioned earlier, and there's the trial, the apology, is where it's recorded in Plato, and then there are a couple dialogues that follow the apology, and the final one is called the Phaedo. That's a description of his actual execution. And it's rather long for Platonic dialogues. There's a long discussion about the immortality of the soul. Socrates is arguing for it, and the other disciples don't believe it, and which is interesting because Socrates was and Plato seem to have been unique in thinking that the soul was immortal in this way. They weren't. They were like countercultural. Well, some weird things happen right as Socrates drinks the poison, and the hemlock is it starts at least in this description, your feet get cold, and then the coldness starts coming up your legs until eventually it gets to your heart, and then you die. Um, some weird things happen, and one of them is that Socrates says, basically, I have to go now. Crito's his friend. Can you please sacrifice a cock to Asclepius, a rooster? Asclepius is the god of healing. And the practice was you would go to his temple, and there's still ruins of this temple, by the way, in Epidaurus, a great set of ruins near Mycenae in Greece. And you go into the temple, and let's say you have a heart condition. Well, you go to sleep in the temple, and I'm sure there are rituals, and you like think about your heart or whatever, and then you wake up, and if Asclepius has blessed you with the cure, you thank him by giving a rooster to the priest, as so the priest can have lunch, basically. Um, to say as you're dying, please, Crito, sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius. Nietzsche interprets that as Socrates is saying, I've been cured of life. Now I get to go to the afterworld. In other words, life is a disease. And he thinks that was Socrates' confession of what life was like for him. That yeah,
For
you
him.
read the Symposium, and he's a great drinker, and everybody loves him, and like
Yeah.
he's all the boys are in love with him, even, and so on. But at his heart's core, he actually hates life. He finds life to be an illness that from which you have to be cured.
Hmm.
And Nietzsche thinks that as you're dying, like right now. you can kind of feel like what's about to happen in the next 2 or 3 seconds. It's kind of like it's on the horizon, but it's not like you have to think about it like the way you have to think about tomorrow morning. You can kind of
Hmm.
feel those next 2 or 3 seconds coming, just like, the 2 or 3 seconds that have just passed there. So in other words, the present as we experience it isn't an infinitesimal dot. It's kind of like a stretch of, a few seconds. And we live in that. And Nietzsche thinks that's, I think he thinks that's how you experience time, but that if you're dying, and time is circular. At the moment of death, you're kind of experiencing the next time, namely when you wake up as a baby or whenever you first become conscious, whenever that is,
Hmm. Hmm.
says. So that in his dying moment, Socrates realized that life is eternally returning. But as his final malicious act, instead of saying, like, everybody, I was wrong. There are no forms. There is no heaven. We're coming around again, croak. No, he took revenge by saying, sacrifice a cock to Asclepius. In other words, he maliciously deceived his disciples right at the last moment as a last act of resentment.
So, in a way, do you agree with that interpretation of Plato?
Well, I don't agree with that story about Socrates. No.
Oh, Socrates, yeah,
It's pretty fanciful. Do I accept Nietzsche's critique of Plato? Is that what you're
yeah,
asking me? Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
Ah,
So,
that's so refreshing to hear a philosopher admit.
okay. Okay. I'm glad.
I'm going to
That's
have to
actually,
kill you now because you're
yeah.
obviously corrupting the youth.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah. 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 Well, um, I sent you a speech, the speech that I gave in my new position, where I
Hmm.
brought together I was trying to do a lot of different things in that speech, but one way of thinking what I was doing was, how I thought of it is like, I've been a professor at Duquesne University for 20 years. Now I'm starting this new unusual position at West Virginia University. And I felt like I wanted to summarize what I learned in 20 years as a
Yeah.
philosophy professor. So that's sort of one thing that I'm doing in that speech. And at the end of that, I pit Nietzsche against Plato on this very question. I give Plato's argument for the forms, which I haven't given in this interview, but I could if you want. It doesn't take that long. And then I pose the Nietzschean critique of it and conclude it by saying, I don't know, and that's why I'm here. Namely, like what's left of me as a philosopher, how many years I have at most 30, but something short of that. I want to finally decide who's right about this. And, without getting into the details, unless you want to, the issue is, are we living in an imperfect world or not? Plato thinks that we're living in an obviously imperfect world.
A facsimile, a fake world, or a
Well, that's
imperfect
what he
world.
thinks. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
fake or imperfect.
Well, he thinks we experience it as imperfect, and that he then infers that it must therefore be fake.
Okay,
But that's part of the
matrix.
inference. And again, I
Okay.
don't want to sound too mysterious because we can do it more systematically, but just to get to the punchline, he thinks we experience the world as imperfect. And in order to judge that something is imperfect, you have to compare it against something.
Yeah.
And what you must be comparing it against is perfection. So you've had an experience of perfection. And his explanation of that is, yeah, you communed with the perfect forms. You fell into a body
Yeah.
in an imperfect shadow realm that's like the cave. And that experience of imperfection is the beginning of philosophy because then you can help yourself recover, especially with a teacher, recover the memory of perfection, which is orienting your soul towards the good, God, ultimately,
Yeah.
and away from the shadow realm. Well, we could talk more about that. That's the nut of Platonism, I think. But just the Nietzschean response to that, as I understand it, is really fundamental. It's that you experience the world as imperfect. That's a you problem. Namely, you are resentful of the world, and the way you express your resentment is, if you were to speak to Plato, is by denigrating the world as imperfect and then creating this fantasy of a perfect world. But all of that is downstream from a fundamental psychological, spiritual problem of resentment against the world. Because if you're not resentful of the world, you won't find it imperfect. You'll find it, well, perfect if you like, but the dichotomy really doesn't apply.
Hmm.
And that feeling of imperfection, that feeling of resentment, excuse me, Nietzsche's diagnosis is that comes from a false time consciousness. That comes from thinking that time is linear and that the past is forever gone. And that makes you so resentful that you take revenge upon life.
There's something about the depictions of Jesus that I've borne witness to in my youth as a Christian and my experiences as a human being that challenges that resentment that lesser forms of Christianity have figured out ways of centralizing.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about the way that Jesus spoke to the people who suffered and
Yes.
touched them without pity and love, I guess, a love without pity, like a fuller form of love that maybe Nietzsche's trying to get to with this thought experiment or this doctrine of the eternal return, trying to wake yourself up, trying to, because doesn't Nietzsche talk about acceptance, like figuring out how to accept your life is
So
key to this doctrine.
well, before he discovers the eternal return, his like attempt at reconciliation with the world, he calls it amor fati, which he borrows from the Stoics, love of fate. In other
Yes.
words, the New Year's resolution is actually New Year's Day, and he says, "From now on, I will love fate." And but
Yeah.
it's like I'm going to force myself to love fate.
Yeah.
And the eternal return, you don't have to, if you have the experience, you don't have to force yourself because you experience it as beautiful, if you like, or joyous.
That's exactly what you're saying at the very beginning of our conversation about if you actually love God, you have perfect freedom, but there's no choice anymore. You're just following,
Yeah,
you're
right,
following the good, which
right.
is infinitely freedom, but you're not really free to violate the good. So it's
That's
this
right.
other form of freedom that's higher.
Exactly. Yes.
It's a transformative form. You said that you presented these two doctrines and you couldn't decide between them. Maybe there's a receiving of your own. Maybe there's this conception of time, destiny, the afterlife, the forms, reality, truth, beauty, that is yours alone to behold and bear the burden of communicating to others.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I want to hear more about what you have in mind, but I guess, if I were to die tomorrow, or for that matter, in 30 years and not resolve this, I would
Mm.
be okay with it in the sense of I feel like I've dramatized it. One can only do
Okay.
so much as a philosopher, and to have dramatized the difference between Plato and Nietzsche, to distill it down to that question, I'd be content with that. Let me tell you about an experience I had that I allude to in the speech that shifted me on this. It was a few years ago, 2020, so I guess 6 years ago now. And I was in a forest, and it just hit me. There was nothing imperfect in the forest. Like, what would it even mean that like that tree was imperfect, or that worm was imperfect, or like that rock was imperfect? There's just nothing imperfect in the forest. And then I just thought, like, what if this forest were 1,000 square miles? There'd be no imperfection for these 1,000 square miles. Then, of course, you could just expand it. And, you have to take a view of humans as part of nature, that if you can accept that nature is not imperfect, then humans as part of nature are not imperfect either.
Mhm.
Again, I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm not
Yeah.
saying I disbelieve it either. It's just that for the first, I'm just such a Platonist at heart
Mm.
that Nietzsche for me is the adventure. Plato is like home. I go out, and explore with Nietzsche, and I come back home to Plato.
Mm.
That thought was one of the first moments where I felt like maybe I could live here in Nietzscheanism for the first time. It wasn't just going outside myself, but maybe coming back, or getting into something that I could inhabit.
Mm. You were alone.
I was, yes.
How far away was your oldest child in miles, roughly speaking?
Oh, that's interesting. Probably about a mile away.
A mile away.
Why do you say? Why is that relevant?
Because that beatific moment is dashed by not just responsibility for somebody, but your love
Mm.
of them and desire to protect them, teach them, rear them, guide them away from bad decisions. Because that's the other thing about the imperfect world. I don't know if the world's imperfect or we're fallen, but it resonates that I make bad decisions and I pay for them.
Yeah.
I don't get away with being bad. And regret and pity are tributaries that flow away from the process of redemption. And undergoing the process of redemption, of being purified, sanctified, redeemed of my mistakes, my debts, that is a process of humbling myself from not being the center of the universe. And that's something about Nietzsche that is there. He really does have main character syndrome.
Yeah.
And he imparts it to you. He's got such main character, like you
Yeah.
feel like the main character of your own life, which is beautiful and excellent and
Yeah.
awesome.
Right.
And I'm
Do you
sure even
remember,
Jesus felt that, but
just on that, do you remember or have you heard the chapter titles of his autobiography? So his autobiography is called Ecce Homo, which Ecce Homo, behold the man, is what Pilate said when Jesus came out.
yeah,
So
to be
you just say, "Here
crucified.
I am, behold me," and then the subtitles or the titles of the chapters are like "Why I Write Such Good Books." That's one chapter. One is "Why I Am a Destiny."
Yeah. He never had kids.
No,
He
no,
was never able to have a relationship with a woman, which is another
That's
thing
right.
that dashes all of these philosophical treatises and why the symposium happens out of earshot of the wives. Symbolically speaking, not because women can't participate in philosophy at all, but because sex and the difference in gender is such a striking phenomenon that breaks the very core of our thinking of all of these ideals and of having these flights of fancy and of having these beatific moments of getting away from these narratives, even getting away from the regime. It pulls us back in. The responsibility, love, messiness, money, like all these things corrupt every given social experiment of like even the perfect academy. Like,
So I want to challenge you on that. Plato describes a an ideal curriculum right after the cave. He describes a 50-year curriculum
well,
to go from birth to revelation of the good. And
wow.
I won't go through all the stages, but
No, that's
like,
fine. I'm going to be 50 in 2 weeks here. So tell me what's at the end of this road, man.
well, as we determined, I'm on the other side of it, so I'm full of sage advice. But for the first 20 years, roughly, you're doing physical activity because these philosophers start as soldiers, and the first 10 years is stories. They have to be formed in the right stories and so on, and then physical activity. So it's kind of physical and musical education for the first 20 years, and then for between 20 and 30, there are these subjects that are in distinct order. Math plays a big role. And the medieval schools picked this up as the quadrivium, I think. At any rate, when they get to 30, they are. It's been a while now, the order, but this is it. They spend 5 years doing what we would now call philosophy, which is not reading history, not learning math, but stepping above the specific disciplines and asking very general questions, especially about how they fit together. And
Yeah.
so the kind of Platonic dialogue questions, like what is courage, what is justice, and so on, and where is it
Ontology,
coming?
epistemology, those
Yeah,
sorts
exactly.
of endeavors. Okay.
Exactly. And the goal of those 5 years, he calls it dialectic. The goal of those 5 years is to have an account of the good. An account, in Greek logos, it's a definition. It's like if somebody had a logos of the good, it would be like having a theology. They could tell you exactly who God is, and they could answer all the objections to people who had heretical views of God, and they give the arguments that God exists, and so on. That would be the ideal logos. of the good or of God. And he thinks that's what they'll have at the end of 5 years because they've been, had all the education that's available and they've learned everything in the right order and then they've gotten this dialectical education. So they're 35 at that point. But the revelation of the good doesn't come till 50. And what happens next is not usually discussed. And I think it's because it's discussed by professors who focus on doing the stuff of those 5 years for their entire lives.
Yeah.
What happens for the next 15 years is they leave the institute and they go out and administer the city. And now here's the point of contact with what you were saying, at least in my own mind. I'd been doing dialectic in his vocabulary in graduate school and, as a young professor, like debating all of these abstract ideas. Then I had kids and, like there were quite absurd moments where I'd be like changing a poopy diaper and like it's all over my hand. And then I've got to like quickly like wipe it off and go and teach Aristotle's categories. And I was very interested in like, what do you learn from being a father? Like I needed to intellectualize it. And, I was on Facebook at the time and, other fathers, who are philosophers would, I'm learning about cognition and like, they're philosophers of mind. I'm learning like primitive cognition, blah, 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 blah. And it was always like, as if the baby were like an illustration of something. And I didn't learn anything like that, but what I experienced was, I think, what Plato was talking about, the reason why those dialecticians have to go and administer the city for 15 years. And it's like 15 years is like his way of saying a long time. To get immersed in practical realities so that that abstract notion of the good that you were able to give a totally sound philosophical definition, but that was worthless until you can see it present in the city, or my experience was present in my family, in my kids.
How old are they?
By now, they're the oldest is 16, and the youngest.
Wow. Oh, last time we spoke, there were kids at your table. They were young.
Are they? Yeah.
I mean, 16's still young, but that's tall.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
He just had a recital today, and he played a Bach prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier. And the last time he was in that recital hall, he was 5 years old, playing basically chopsticks. And I was thinking, wow. Gen Z is going to be all right. That's another thought that I had. Like, I have no worries about Gen Z. I think, everything I said, I stand by, namely they're living in the wasteland. But the thing is, they know it. And that the craving for authenticity, the craving for beauty is just so much more pure and authentic than what I believe our generation had.
So you got to go eat dinner, I'm sure.
I could go all night if you want to, but I'm too wound up. I'm not going to eat for a while. It's going to take a while to come down. But if that's your polite way of saying we should wind this down, that's totally fine.
We should wind it down. But I was trying to think of a clever way to ask you where your content is, but people have to enroll to get it, don't they?
Yeah.
Where are you teaching and what?
Yeah. So I'm teaching at West Virginia University. I just started there in January. I am officially in the Department of Philosophy, so there's that. But really what I am is I'm the founding director of a new center at WVU, and it's called the Washington Center for Civics, Culture, and Statesmanship. And I've only been in the job almost 6 months now, so I've been hiring people, I've been presenting courses, been doing media interviews and so on, trying to get attention for the new thing. But if there are 16, 17-year-olds out there who like what I had to say in this interview, I encourage you to apply. It's a broad range of courses that I put up, and I've hired some, I think deep thinkers. What I was really looking for in the people I was hiring was courage. What I said earlier about the conformity of the academy, I think that's a real shortcoming. And so I looked for people who had demonstrated that they were willing to go against the grain, in concrete ways. So, I'm trying to populate the classrooms of my center with courageous thinkers who will allow you to speak freely and honor your ideas and not dismiss, not try to cancel you. They might dismiss it as, that's absurd and like here's the argument against it. It's not going to be touchy feely, but nobody's going to get canceled. Let me put it that way.
You have the institutional backing to not cancel people.
Yeah. I mean, there are civil rights laws, so.
Of course there are.
Yeah.
We haven't fixed everything, but I'm kidding.
I'm learning about free speech that, the center was founded, one of its missions, it's got a complex mission, but to revive the study of Western civilization as something good, to study the American Constitution, American Republican self-government, and so on in light of the goodness of Western civilization as a kind of phenomenon of Western civilization, and I think even as a kind of flower of it, and then to address the issues of the day in a way that has not, I think, been generally done in universities in the last 10 years, where there won't be forbidden positions. With the footnote, from the joke just a few minutes ago, that I've realized that although there's going to be more free speech in my center, as much as I can get away with and I'll, my colleagues can get away with, the idea of free speech, especially in our current regime, is somewhat of a fantasy because there are laws against saying things. Yeah. And, so we're going to be as free as we can be. Let's put it that way.
There's, not to mire our talk and other issues, but hey, thanks for getting to the end of the talk. Well, the end of the recording so far as you're concerned, unless you're a channel member. So I'm putting the rest of it behind the paywall. I rarely ever do this. We do get really loosey-goosey and stuff and trying to strategize how to preserve a particular point of view or openness to various points of view on my channel that, not everybody's open to. Not to be too enticing, actually. I just kind of go off the cuff a little bit. But it's good conversation. Again, check out links to all the relevant details down there in the description, and you all have a good night.